Greetings. Can you all hear?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's an interesting story you just told about the women and her slaves, which reminds me that even today, blacks and whites can see the same thing, but have totally different interpretations. I want to begin by thanking thanking the folk here at Kennesaw for having me back again. My good friend Brian Wills, he and I go back close to 30 years. You claim yourself part of the grain generation. I'm not ready to claim that yet. But Brian and I have a very long history of friendship, lots of things in common. Racquetball players, you remember the days I used to run around with a racquetball player. I still play. You play? I don't. He was an avid poker player, won most of my money. He loves good blues music. ZZ Hill. We have a lot in common. Brian and I have lots of interest, and I'm grateful to you for asking me to come back again to this great university. Very impressed with this facility. Thanks to you all for coming, and thanks to all of the folk who have been so generous and gracious in your greetings and your hospitality. To my two colleagues who have gone before me this morning, thank you for sharing the stage with me. I have to trim a little bit off of this because I want to try to get us out of here around about 12 o'clock. I don't want to abuse my privilege. But I'm going to say a little bit about what freedom meant. At the end of the Civil War meant to the freedmen, with a little bit of focus on some of the early years, because when you talk about what's at the end of the war meant to the freedmen, that gets into the era of Reconstruction, which dates from 1865 to 1877. Now, I say, by way of disclaimer, I am not a Civil War historian. I'm a Civil War enthusiast. I'm a civil rights historian. And as you already pointed out, the connections between the two are inevitable. And they are necessary because they give us the sort of the historical bookends, the markers. I don't think it's any coincidence that as we commemorate the sesquicentennial of the end of the Civil War, just a few weeks ago, we commemorate the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. There are so many markers and milestones that are connected. Also, by way of disclaimer, the tone of this presentation is not quite so lighthearted because so much of it took place between 1865 and 1877 is rather dark. So, not much laughter is what I would say to you. The 21st century Americans, the case against slavery may appear to be self-evident. Most of us have no doubt about the profound injustice of a system in which some people are property of other people. We know that today. But 19th century opponents of slavery faced quite a different social consensus on the issue. They had to make the case for abolishing an institution that dominated the economic and social structure of the southern states. They also had to address widespread anxiety about how the nation would integrate these freed slaves, we call them freedmen, into its social, political, and economic fabric. Now, it's often been said that the slaves knew that the Civil War was being fought because of them long before the soldiers or politicians did. That may be true in part. The larger truth is everybody knew. The black slaves were the first ones to acknowledge it. Now, Northerners and Lincoln and Union wanted to preserve the Union. If you ask Lincoln why we fight this war, he would answer every game. He just wanted to preserve the Union. For obvious reasons, he's not going to talk too much about slavery because he's got to raise Northern white soldiers. You ask Jefferson Davis and the Confederates what they were fighting for, and he said, well, we fight for states' rights. Obviously, he's not going to talk too much about ending slavery because he's got to raise an army too. You got to convince poor white boys to fight to preserve an institution in which they have no vested interest. Though both Lincoln and Davis pointed out knew that slavery would not survive the war, Confederate defeat and the end of slavery brought about far-reaching changes in the lives of all Southerners. Destruction of slavery led to conflict between blacks seeking to breathe substantive meaning into their freedom by asserting their independence from white control, and from whites seeking to retain as much as possible of the old order, the way that things used to be. Roughly 38,000 African Americans perished in the Union Army soldiers, as did tens of thousands more in refugee camps and Confederate labor gangs. I don't believe in death by PowerPoint, but I do have a few things that might give you something visually to look at. The meaning of freedom itself became the point of conflict in the Reconstruction South. As former slaves relished the opportunity to flaunt their liberation from the innumerable regulations of slavery. Immediately after the Civil War, they sought to give meaning to freedom by reuniting their families that had been separated under slavery, establishing their own churches and schools, seeking economic autonomy, demanding equal civil and political rights. Now, most white Southerners reacted to defeat and emancipation with dismay. Many white families had suffered loss of loved ones and the destruction of property. Some thought of leaving the South altogether, or retreated into nostalgia for the old South and for the lost cause of the Confederacy. In 1865 and 1866, many white Southerners joined memorial associations that established Confederate cemeteries and monuments throughout the nation. Others, unwilling to accept a new relationship to former slaves, resorted to violent opposition to the new world being created around them, and over which they seemed to have so little control. Reuniting families separated under slavery and solidifying those family relations were essential to the black definition of freedom, because the family stood as the fundamental pillar of post-war black society. Most slaves had lived in family units, although they faced the constant threat of separation from loved ones by sale. Freed people made remarkable efforts to locate their loved ones. A Northern report in 1865 encountered a former slave who walked more than 600 miles searching for his wife and children, from whom he had been sold during slavery. Many freedmen ran ads in local newspapers trying to find lost loved ones who had been sold away, with varying degrees of success. In the early days of freedom, thousands of African Americans married under the authority of the Freedmen's Bureau. And that 1866 poster gives you some idea of what white Southerners in the South thought of the Freedmen's Bureau. Can you all read that? No. Yeah. Let's see what it says. It says, an agency to keep the Negro in idleness at the expense of the white man. Twice vetoed by the president, that would be Andrew Johnson, and made a law by Congress. Support Congress, you support the Negro. Sustain the president, and you protect the white man. So this is one of many cartoons that you see inside during the years that the Freedmen's Bureau was in operation. Now, Bureau records indicate that some marriages involved young men and women who were marrying for the very first time, while others merely legalized unions that they had made in slavery, since slave marriages had no legal authority. But the story of black freedom in the post-war years cannot be fully appreciated unless one understands that it was accompanied by raw terror. Violence swept across parts of the South in the aftermath of the Civil War, reflecting the immense tensions created by the end of slavery and Confederate defeat, and white Southerners' determined resistance to black people's quest for autonomy. Free people were assaulted and murdered for attempting to leave plantations, for disputing contract arrangements, for seeking to enter white-controlled churches, and for refusing to step off of sidewalks to allow white pedestrians to pass. Occasionally, as in Memphis and New Orleans in the riots in 1866, black communities became the victims of wholesale assault by white mobs, aided often by local police. In these outbreaks, schools, churches, and other community institutions, symbols of black freedom became targets of violence, as well as private homes and individual blacks themselves. During 3 days of racial violence in Memphis in May 1866, white mobs destroyed hundreds of structures in the black community, including a school. At least 46 blacks, most of them Union veterans, died, and more than 70 were wounded. 5 black women were raped, 12 churches and 4 schools were burned. But now, there were triumphs too. Between 1868 and 1901, 22 African Americans served in the United States Congress, believe it or not. 20 served in the House of Representatives, and 2, Ira Rebels and Blanche Bruce, served in the United States Senate, both from the state of Mississippi. Strange twist of irony, as some of you already know, probably all of you know, Hiram Rebels took the seat that once belonged to former President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis. And among those who know this part of our history, many are unaware of the fact that a good number of white Southerners waged a concerted campaign to deny these black representatives the seats they had won. Whites in Mississippi fought vigorously to oppose our rebels. 5 of the first 20 blacks elected to the House of Representatives were denied their seats. 10 others had their terms interrupted or delayed. These charges against these individuals were frivolous and frequently fabricated, often having to do with alleged voting irregularities. On the state level, it didn't necessarily get any better. The good state of Georgia becomes the only state in the Union ever to be kicked out. Georgia had been readmitted in 1868, but Georgia was kicked out of the Union shortly after being readmitted because it refused to seat 28 newly elected black members of the Georgia General Assembly. Anybody know this fellow? George Henry White of North Carolina will be the last United States congressman for many years because he asked black people to disappear from the voting rolls. And I'll get to that in a minute. So too disappeared their ability to elect their officials. And so by 1900, black disfranchisement throughout the South, in face of the former Confederacy, it's pretty much complete. And so as black voters disappear, then black officials disappear. George White leaves Congress in 1901. Not until Oscar DePriest is elected to the House of Representatives in Chicago in 1928, 27 years later, but another black sit in Congress. It would not be until 1972, 71 years later, when blacks from the South would once again be elected to Congress. Andrew Young, Georgia. Robert Jordan, Texas. And not until 1992 would another black sit in Congress representing the state of North Carolina. That's 91 years after George White's departure. For the next 100 years, discourtesies and decencies shown to these black lawmakers because of race became the standard operating procedure in abusing black elected officials. There are many monuments to Confederate defeat, but there are none to Reconstruction. Much has been written about the so-called failures of Reconstruction. The problem with that terminology is that it's framed in the passive voice. So I made the point on last evening, Reconstruction did not fail. It was violently overthrown with impunity and audacity in one of the bloodiest, darkest, and still least known chapters of American history. The Colfax Massacre, some of you may have heard about it. Colfax Massacre. Black folk who were part of it, who were victimized, and rather they call it a massacre. Whites in Louisiana call it a riot, really genocide. But it occurred on Easter Sunday, April 13, 1873, in Colfax, Louisiana, seat of Pratt Parish. And this happened as a result of a confrontation between political forces of Republicans and Democrats. Turned out that most of the Republicans were black and the Democrats, Southern Democrats, were white. So in the wake of a contested 1872 election for governor of Louisiana and local offices, a group of white Democrats, armed with rifles and a small cannon, overpowered black Republican freedmen and state militia also black, who were trying to control the courthouse. Most of the freedmen were killed after they had surrendered. Nearly 50 were killed later that night after being held prisoners for several hours. Estimates of the number of dead ranges anywhere from 100 to 153. Many of the black victims, 3 whites were also killed. Many of the black victims were difficult to determine because bodies had been thrown into the river, removed for burial. There were also rumors of mass graves. The historian Eric Foner, one of the most respected in the country, described this massacre as the worst instance of racial violence during Reconstruction. Foner wrote, and I'm quoting him now, "Every election in Louisiana between 1868 and 1876 was marked by rampant violence and pervasive fraud." End quote. Now, federal prosecution and conviction of a few of the perpetrators in the Colfax massacre under the Enforcement Acts was appealed to the Supreme Court. In a key case, this case was United States versus Cruikshank in 1876. The Supreme Court ruled that the protections of the 14th Amendment did not apply to the actions of individuals, but only to actions of state governments. In other words, state governments cannot engage in the wholesale, indiscriminate slaughter of black people, but white individuals can. This is an effective rule in 76. So after this ruling, the federal government could no longer use the Enforcement Act of 1870 to prosecute actions by paramilitary groups such as the White League, the Ku Klux Klan, the Knights of the White League, and dozens of others. You couldn't use the law to prosecute them. And so intimidation and black voter suppression by these paramilitary groups were instrumental to the Democratic Party regaining political control in the state legislature by the late 1870s. I found this slide there. This is a 1950 marker, Colfax riot, notice that terminology. On this side occurred the Colfax riot in which 3 white men and 150 Negroes were slain. This event marked the end of carpetbag misrule. Need I say more? The end of carpetbag misrule in the South. From the Colfax Massacre in Louisiana in 1873, Hamburg Massacre in South Carolina, 1876, and numerous other massacres, race riots, pogroms that came after more than 3,000 freedmen and their white Republican allies were murdered in a campaign of terrorist violence that overthrew legitimately elected governors. Among the dead were more than 60 state senators, judges, legislators, sheriffs, constables, mayors, county commissioners, and other office holders whose only crime was to have been elected. They were lynched by bands of disguised men who dragged them from cabins by night or were fired on from ambush or along the roadsides or on a prearranged signal being lured into a ballroom by a false friend to be murdered, shot so many times that the corpse was nothing but shreds, pulled off trains in broad daylight by a group of heavily armed men resembling a company of Confederates and shot repeatedly at point-blank range. So saturated is our collective memory of Gone with the Wind stock characters, of thieving carpetbaggers and low scalawags and ignorant darkies, that it comes as a shock to discover that there were men and women of courage, idealism, rectitude, and vision who risked everything to try to build a new society of equality and justice on the ruins of the Civil War. Individuals who fought to give lasting meaning to the sacrifice of that terrible struggle and who tried to make real the long-delayed American promise. All men were created equal. Confident in the moral righteousness of their cause, secure in the ringing declarations which were now embodied in the 13th, the 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. We call those the Reconstruction era amendments. And not only was slavery dead, but that equality and freedom now belonged to all Americans. These brave souls could not imagine that their nation could win such a terrible war and yet lose the ensuing peace. The 13th Amendment, very briefly, ratified in 1865, contained the promise of the end of slavery. But as you know, the 13th Amendment was undermined by sharecropping and debt peonage and convict leasing, something that Doug Blackman often refers to as slavery by another name, that in many respects was worse than slavery. The lives of these black men had no economic value. During the years of slavery, slaves were property. White bastards didn't just go around killing slaves just for the other. Brian Fielding could bring in, what, $1,500, $2,000? It's property, it's your investment. But during this era, these black men's lives had no economic value. In some respects, they were like the Irish who came over in the 1850s. The Irish would die, you get another one, right? Same thing with these black folk. One died, you get another one. And so you had children, this is how some of them lived, shackled together in these little rolling carts. Children as young as 10 were abused by this practice. The mortality rate in some of these camps was as high as 45%. This is a punishment being meted out to some young boy that doesn't feel much more than 12 or 13 or so. But the whole era of convict leasing is slavery by another name. We don't still trying to understand the depths of it and just how pervasive it was in this society. Now, the 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, contained the promise of citizenship. But that was undermined by the Supreme Court's 1896 decision in Plessy versus Ferguson, which of course gave the court's imprimatur to separate but equal. Now, we often say, I've said, that the Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 overturned Plessy. You ever say that? That Brown v. Board overturned Plessy. Well, in fact, it really didn't. Now, and I'll explain. See, Plessy versus Ferguson came about as a result of where blacks could sit on a train in Louisiana. But in time, that separate but equal, that originally only applied to where blacks are still on trains became much broader. So that as the years passed, it applied not just to trains, but to streetcars and hotels and motels and restaurants and parks and swimming pools and libraries and lunch counters and water fountains and restrooms and hospitals and cemeteries and public schools. You go to court, you have 2 separate Bibles. Blacks were on one Bible, whites were on another. Separate phone booths, vending machines. I think Oklahoma had laws that whites and blacks couldn't play checks together. Craziness. And so it went that segregation was a part of American life, every aspect, from the cradle to the grave. That was Plessy was brown. But Brown, on the other hand, was very limited in scope. You know that. Because what Chief Justice Warren wrote is that in the matter of public education, separate but equal has no place. See, had Brown been as broad in its reach as Plessy, we may never have known who Rosa Parks was. Because all the stuff that came later might not have been necessary. The 15th Amendment gave blacks the right to vote. You say that too bad, but it really didn't. 15th Amendment does not confer upon anybody the right to vote. It merely says that the right to vote cannot be denied or abridged on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. That's not quite the same as saying that you can vote. And so what you have is that, as I said, therein lies the rub, because it's a tribute to the ingenuity of white Southerners that they were able to make a mockery of the 15th Amendment for 95 years. With literacy tests, and poll taxes, and residency requirements, and property requirements, and so forth, and so on. And once again, the United States Supreme Court, in the very important case of Williams versus Mississippi, gave its blessings to these kinds of restrictions. Anybody familiar with that case? Williams versus Mississippi, 1898. The court says that states have the right to define their own electorate so long as they do not violate the letter of the 15th Amendment. Not until the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 that African Americans were able to vote in significant numbers. Let me say just a little bit about this Williams versus Mississippi case, because it may be unfamiliar. The plaintiff in this case was a black man named Henry Williams, and he had been indicted for murder by one all-white jury and convicted by another all-white jury. And his argument that he made through his legal counsel was that because blacks had been excluded from jury service following their effective disfranchisement under Mississippi's new Constitution of 1890, that this indictment and conviction were illegal. Because the provisions for literacy tests and poll tax essentially eliminated blacks as voters. And as you know, if the only way you get thrown into the jury pool is that you are registered voter. The United States Supreme Court unanimously, 9-0, rejected his contention, ruling that the state's requirements for voters to pass tests and pay taxes did not discriminate against blacks, as these were applied to all voters, despite the fact that the grandfather clause exempted white folk if they could meet certain constitutions that their fathers or grandfathers had been registered voters by. You all know that. And with that, in that case, the promise of the 15th Amendment remained unfulfilled. But even after all of this, blacks did not go quietly and took a good night. And I like history, I love it, I made it my life's work. I think history is important because historical antecedents are important. You all know this woman, Ida B. Wells Barnett. The freedom and the rights that became a reality in the 20th century, this is where sort of the Civil War and Civil Rights sort of meet. The freedoms and rights that became a reality in the 20th century had their historical antecedents in the 19th. Now, you all know a black seamstress named Rosa Parks in Alabama. On one cold, rainy day in December 1st, 1955, refused to give a receipt to a white man on the bus. But did you know that on May 4th, 1884, this woman, Ida B. Wells Barnett, refused to move when a train conductor with the Memphis and Charleston Railway ordered her to leave the first class ladies' car and moved to a smoking car. This woman was born a slave in Holly Springs, Mississippi in 1862. She told her white conductor she won't go nowhere. She stayed in her seat. They eventually pulled her off of the train. The conductor and two men dragged her out of the car. She returned to Memphis, hired a black lawyer to sue the railroad company, but the railroad company paid off a black lawyer, so she got rid of that scoundrel and hired herself a white one. She won her case December 24th, 1884. The local circuit court awarded her a $500 judgment against the railroad. Now, the railroad company appealed to the Tennessee Supreme Court, which reversed the lower court's ruling in 1887. So she did not prevail, but she helped lay the groundwork, and she did this 71 years before Rosa Parks. My last slide, I'm done now. You all know this man. You heard of Charles Hamilton Houston. Charlie Houston was born in 1895, the year before Kennesaw. He is referred to as the man who killed Jim Crow. He was educated at Harvard. Came on to be the first black to edit the Harvard Law Review. He would go on to train a cadre of young civil rights attorneys at Howard University in D.C., named after Union General Oliver Otis Howard, one of the nation's premier HBCUs. And this man trained a cadre of young civil rights attorneys who would carry on the battle to end segregation after he passed on. Now, his most noted pupil was, of course, Thurgood Marshall. My students know Thurgood Marshall coming in, but they've never heard of this man. This was a man that taught Thurgood. He trained him. He said that a lawyer is either a social engineer or he is a parasite on society. He says, unlike doctors, we do not have the luxury of burying our mistakes. So the mistakes that we make today linger with us and society for many years to come. Charlie Houston worked himself to death. People who knew him best say they never saw him at a social function. He didn't do cocktails. He didn't do meet and greets. He put in 16, 18 hours a day. Even after his own personal physician said, Charlie, you're going to kill yourself if you don't stop. He says, I don't have time. I got to work. I don't have time to stop. And so he literally worked himself to death. In an inscription to his son, in a book that he wrote, a book that he was reading just before he died, he said, I know my time with you is not as long as it should be, but in every fight some fall. Such has been my calling. And so he helped lay the groundwork, aptly titled by UNC Professor General McNeil. And then came Barack Obama and the nation's changing demographics, showing white males becoming a smaller percentage of the electorate, and new voting restrictions, and attempts at voter suppression, and new voter ID laws, and fewer days of early voting, and lifetime felony disfranchisement, making it more difficult for felons to have their voting privileges restored. And once again, the United States Supreme Court, this one led by Chief Justice John Roberts, gave its blessings. Shelby County, Alabama versus Holder, 2013, in which the court gutted key provisions of the Voting Rights Act. And so here we are, just having commemorated the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama. Are we celebrating 50 years of freedom? Are we commemorating historical milestones and events? I do not know. But I'll leave you with this thought. We've heard this morning about what ifs. Here's a what if for you. Consider this. What if the promise of Reconstruction had been fulfilled? Our nation's history would have followed a very different trajectory. I thank you.